Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sure. Oh, Jenna, now we have some friends from across Indonesia. And first of all, thank you for your coming, and I really appreciate your time. It's like 7 p.m. in Canada, right?
Yeah, it's 7 a.m.
Yo, it's really early morning. Thank you, you make it today. And so we have friends from different island in Indonesia, different province. We have friend from Palu is in the middle Sulawesi, center Sulawesi, and then we have friend from East Nusa Tenggara, from Kupang. We have friend from Oregon. This is like student in Oregon, and then we have friend from Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. We also have friend from Subang, West Java. We have friend from Australia and Tunisia as well. They are Indonesian, but they study in Australia and study in Tunisia. And also we have friend from Bogor. It's like also West Java. So I'm really happy this morning, and we're still waiting. People like maybe they will coming in second. So I think because you're now here, so we can like maybe you can start with introducing yourself. I just already introduce you to the people, but maybe it's like limited because I just introduce your background in mental health just a little bit. So you can also explain more about yourself, your activities, and you can also continue to, if you have presentation or something, you can share in the screen.
Yeah.
And after like 20 or 25 minutes, we can start our discussion and maybe answering question from the from our friends in Millennial Research Center. Is that okay for you?
Yes, that sounds great.
Oh, cool. Great. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay. Okay, guys, we can start from Jenna's introduction. Please, Jenna.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Okay.
Perfect. Awesome.
Can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Yes, so it's a privilege to be presenting to all of you. I'm so excited. I'm Jenna. I did my PhD in public health, and I did that at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. So I lived in the US for 4 years, but I'm Canadian and I'm back in Canada now. And my research has focused on the social factors that affect mental health and addiction. So I look at both mental health and substance use, and the two are very related. But throughout all of those, I look at social factors like trauma and income, employment, and how those affect mental health and addiction. And I will say that most of my experience is in the Western context. So I apologize for that because I know this is the Indonesian Millennial Research Center. And so I hope that what I say today will still be relevant for all of you and interesting. But most of my examples, unfortunately, are from the Canadian and American context because that's where I've worked so far. And I am, in fact, a millennial. I was very surprised to learn that I fall in the category of millennials. Yeah, you know, it's a funny thing because I didn't identify that way. But when I looked at what years are actually included, I'm right on the edge. I was born in the 80s, right on the edge of the millennial cusp, I guess. But yes, so when I was preparing for this talk, I was actually thinking quite a bit about my friends and, you know, and my own experiences growing up and what some of the statistics mean for me personally. So it was a really interesting exercise to put together a presentation on young adult mental health and specifically for millennials. And I am not an expert in young adult mental health. Most of my research looks actually at early childhood and the factors that happen in early childhood that affect mental health much later in life. But I am familiar with the literature. So knowing that you all are part of the Millennial Research Center, you might have some insights. And so feel free, please, to add to what I say. And and add extra context from your own experiences and your own research. So that's a little bit about me. It's very nice to meet all of you, and I have a pretty informal presentation style, so feel free to interrupt and ask a question, and I hope this will be an interactive presentation. So I want to start with a question. We often hear that mental illness is caused by genetics. Somebody in your family has a mental illness, and so you're more at risk for it. So I'm going to start by asking people, what role do you think genetics play in mental illness? Do you think it's responsible for 15% of mental illness? Do you think it's higher, 25, maybe 50%, or maybe almost all of your experience of mental health issues is determined by genetics, and maybe it's more like 75. So I don't know if there's an easy way to do a poll on, maybe I'll just get you all to think about it. And I was thinking it might be, we could raise hands, but there's no way I can see everybody's hand at once. So, okay, we'll forget about it. So just think in your mind about what you think the answer is, and we're going to come back to this question again right at the very end. So I'm not going to tell you the answer yet, but stay tuned and see if you can pin down the right answer by the end of the presentation. So I'm actually not going to talk about genetics at all today. I'm going to talk about social factors. And as a way to think about this, I want each of you to think about your own mental health. So we all have mental health. We all have physical health. We all have mental health. And at different points in our life, it's more positive, and at different points in our life, it's more negative. So I want you all to think for a minute about a time in your life when your mental health has not been very good, a time that's been pretty difficult. And I want you to think for a minute about the things that were going on in your life at that time. And I'll give everybody just a second to think about it quietly and privately to yourself, and think about some of the things that were happening in your life then. And so the reason I asked you all to do this is because once people start thinking about their own mental health and what things were going on in their lives when they felt really good, and what things were going on in their lives when they felt really not as good mentally, we start to realize that it's very complicated, and there's usually a lot of things that affect our mental health. And almost never do we hear the story of somebody who has a psychiatric disorder or mental health issue when things are going perfectly. You never hear, I got a promotion and I just got married and I was so happy and all of a sudden I got depression, right? It's usually the opposite. And I know when I think about my own life and when my mental health has been the lowest, it was right when my parents were getting divorced, and my father had moved away and I was all alone. And so there were a lot of social factors going on that led to that feeling. And so as we go through our talk today, and as I present some of this research and these statistics, I want you to keep in mind how complicated it is, and how much usually goes into affecting how somebody feels on a day-to-day basis. And these broader social factors really do make a large difference. So to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, what kind of research I do, I'm going to start with a story. And so the story goes, there was a woman who was walking along a river, and she saw someone drowning. And she rushed and she saved the person and pulled them out of the water. And just when she got them onto land and safe, and they were breathing okay again, then she saw another person drowning. And so she goes back to the river and she rescues the second person. And before that person even gets out of the water, she sees two more people drowning. And so she calls for help, and she can't catch people fast enough because there's so many people drowning. So she calls for help, and somebody comes to help. And that person walks, they say, okay, you keep saving people, I'm going to find out what's going on. And so they walk upstream, and they realize actually that there's a bridge that's broken down, and so that people are falling systematically into the river and drowning. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because this is sort of a parable or an analogy for public health. So the public health approach is actually to fix the bridge. So when we think about the difference between medical doctors and public health practitioners, medical doctors tend to fix people one at a time once they're already sick. And in the world of mental health, psychiatrists and psychologists tend to fix people when they're drowning, right? They intervene when there's a crisis and they help people to recover. But the kind of research that I do and the kind of work that I do fixes the bridge. So I look at factors that prevent people from getting sick in the first place. And I look at factors that help to ensure that nobody actually falls in the water and that nobody has a crisis. And part of the difficult thing about this is that when you fix social factors, you can't actually tell what the impact would have been if you didn't do it, right? It's very hard to tell if you're doing your job properly because people just keep walking on the bridges and, you don't know how many lives you would have saved. So as I go through this research presentation, you can keep in mind the perspective of public health and the idea of fixing social factors that make it easier for people to experience positive mental health. This is a little blurb about the definition of public health, and I'll share this with you after so you can hang on to it, but I think I explained it okay. So now to start talking about mental health, it's important to say that not all stress is bad. So you might think of examples, perhaps, of stress in your own life that's been good. And this is actually quite normal. Stress can be a good thing. Does anybody have an example of something that they might consider a good stress in their life? I know most people are on mute and it's a little bit hard to...
Somebody can share their experience about stress?
Yeah.
Bai, you want to say something? Do you feel you stressed now? Anyone?
Oh yeah.
You want to say? Okay, yeah, we can just continue and we can.
Sure. I think Nuri had her hand up. Yeah.
Manuro?
Maybe.
Okay, Nurul.
Okay. Yeah, I try to stress for a good side. For the example, is worrying about before you give presentation, probably.
Yeah.
I have a meeting
Exactly.
with someone to give your ideas or something, to express your ideas. Yeah.
Perfect. That was an absolutely perfect example. And that was actually the example that I put on my slide here.
Wow.
So there's actually lots of examples of good stress. So it helps you. You perform better when you are slightly nervous before something. So before giving this talk, my brain knew that I was going to give a talk. And so it started to think more sharply and to pay attention a little bit more to external cues and to factors that might help me to succeed. And so your brain responds in sort of a heightened state to stress. And that helps you very much in the short term. It helps you to perform and it helps you to pay attention to the right things and block out the wrong things so that you can do your best. And we think of this typically as fight or flight. And it tends to be very beneficial. It's a neurobiological thing that happens that's beneficial in the short term. But the problem is that for some people who experience high levels of stress continuously, when that doesn't go away, it's actually maladaptive. It's bad for your body because living in this heightened state of stress causes you to not be able to sleep as well, and it causes you to react negatively and not to see all of the external factors that are going on because your brain is narrowing on the task at hand. So when we have people, this is a picture, I used to live in Los Angeles. This is a picture I took of Skid Row, which is an area with extremely high homelessness in Los Angeles. And so when you have people who experience chronic stress on a day-to-day basis, it's actually very, very toxic for your brain because you're in this constant heightened state of neural arousal, and it can be quite problematic. So not all stress is bad, but certainly some stress is bad, and that can lead to mental disorders. So I'm going to talk now about the difference between mental health and mental disorder. So I said at the beginning that we all have mental health, and typically we kind of blur the lines between mental illness and mental health. We think of them as the same thing, but actually they're different. So this example here is what we usually think of as people doing well. You know, you don't have a mental disorder, you're feeling pretty good on a day-to-day basis, and so you have positive mental health and positive you don't have a mental disorder. Then we think of also people in this category where you have a mental disorder, perhaps you have depression, perhaps you have post-traumatic stress disorder, perhaps you have schizophrenia. So you have a disorder, and then you also are experiencing negative mental health on a day-to-day basis every day, where it's hard to cope and it's hard to survive. But I want to bring your attention today to the fact that you can actually be in this category too. So you can actually be diagnosed with a mental disorder, and you can be experiencing positive mental health. So if you are accessing treatment, if you're well supported by your friends and family, the experience of having a mental disorder actually doesn't mean that you have bad mental health. You can be feeling quite good on a day-to-day basis, even with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or depression or bipolar. And then on the other side, you can actually not have a diagnosis of mental disorder, but you can be feeling very poor mental health. And we all go through good times and bad times. We all go through highs and lows. And so people seek treatment in all four of these areas. So it's not just when things are going bad and you're feeling negative mental health, but people can and should access treatment in all of these four boxes, because you can definitely receive support and help when you're feeling negative mental health, but you don't yet have a disorder, and that often prevents people from developing more severe disorders. Okay, so now to talk about what we actually came to talk about, which is mental health for millennials. I was again going to ask you all a question, but it seems like it's a little bit hard to do that in this webinar format. So I'll ask you all to think about, what time in life do you think is mental health the biggest issue? Do you think it's early in childhood? Do you think it's in youth or young adulthood? Or is it when people are aging towards the end of their life? So
I feel like when I'm going adult, it's more stress, Jenna. When I'm going adult, stress is more for me. I don't know. Maybe somebody else have opinion.
When I'm doing my PhD, it's more stressful.
Yes, my PhD was also one of the most stressful times of my life. Yeah. Well, and so both of you are correct that we typically see the most mental health issues in youth and young adulthood. So 75% of all disorders happen before age 24. So by the time you're in your mid-20s, typically if you're going to get a mental disorder, you already have it. And so prevalence rates for mental disorder are highest in young adulthood and adolescence, and that rate is 1 in 5. So 22% of all young adults have a mental disorder at any given time point, and the two most common are depression, major depressive disorder, and anxiety. So those two disorders make up the bulk of mental health issues in the population. And that's true across all ages, but you know, it's especially true in young adulthood. And so of these 1 in 5 adolescents who have mental health issues, young adults, and now they are millennials, because now it's millennials who are in this time in our history, right? Only 1 in 3 of them actually end up getting treatment. So we definitely do have a mental health crisis for young adults, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just a few generations ago, actually, in the 50s, for example, depression and suicide were thought of as conditions that happen in middle age. And we've seen the age of onset of disorders gradually get earlier and earlier throughout the generations, so that actually this situation that we have now, where 75% of all disorders have their onset before age 24, this is relatively new in our historical timeline. So to answer the question that we all came here to learn, are millennials more stressed than previous generations? It turns out that this question is actually very complicated. So I'm going to save the final verdict on this for after I explain it. But if we take, you have to excuse the bad infographics, that icons. I just chose them to kind of represent what was happening over time. But if we look at what's happened throughout the 20th century, and again, this is especially specific to the West, because most of my experience is in the US and Canada, we actually see that only 1 to 2% of Americans born before 1915 experienced depression during their lifetime. And that's compared to about 17% now. So we've seen this huge increase in depression, and to think that those people actually lived through the Great Depression in the US, and they lived through world wars. So definitely something is happening in our culture and in our lifestyle that's increasing mental health issues. And the time in history that they have been the worst is actually the 1990s. So we've seen throughout the 1900s increasing mental health issues in the population, as I said. And even when no matter how you look at this, if you study people over time, if you study cohorts, no matter how you look at it, you see increases in rates of pretty much all mental disorders over time. And then you get to the 1990s, and it gets kind of complicated. It depends on who you ask, and it depends on how you measure it. But either mental health is staying the same, or getting slightly better, or getting a little bit worse. But it really depends on how you measure it. And so there's reason to believe that there was sort of a crisis of mental health issues in the 1990s and early 2000s, and that things might be getting a little bit better. In particular, severe disorders have actually gotten a little bit better. So the suicide rate, for example, was the highest it's ever been in the West in 1997. And since that time, it's gotten actually much better, and it's returned closer to the rates that it was at in the 1980s. And we see the same thing for depression, and so for some of the other major disorders. Some of the places where we're not as sure what's going on is if you, for example, do a survey with people and you measure their levels of anxiety. So if you ask people how they're feeling, and if you look at some of the less severe measures and we were talking about mental health versus mental disorder. So if you look at some indicators of mental health and how much anxiety and how much stress people are feeling, you do tend to see those numbers either plateau or slightly increase, perhaps. So it could be that people are, like, some of the more severe things are getting better, but some of the less severe things, either people are becoming more aware of them and are feeling them more acutely, or they actually could be getting worse. So it's a very complex picture, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that might be happening. So between the 1900s and the 1990s, we saw several social changes happening in the West. We saw this increasing trend towards isolation and individualism. So more and more people became individualistic and also more isolated, more independent. And there was less focus on collective structures and on family units, and more focus on the individual. We also saw sort of an increase in perfectionism and expectations. So people's expectations for their own lives and their accomplishments actually increased throughout this time period. And when you have expectations that you don't meet, that's actually something that really impacts your mental health. Socially, we also saw fewer bonds. So for example, lower divorce rates, there's higher divorce rates and lower marriage rates throughout this period. And higher crime rates. So in the 1990s, the crime rates were the highest they ever have been in history, in the US especially. And that certainly, most people believe, contributed to this kind of increasing trend of mental health issues. And then we have the measurement issue. So typically you would control for this in a study, and most people do, but there is, it's important to note that we have gotten better at measuring mental health. And so the better you get at measuring it, the better your questions get, the more you're going to find mental health issues in the population. And although there is still quite a bit of stigma, people have gotten mental health issues are less stigmatized than they used to be, and people are a little bit more comfortable reporting them. So these are always adjusted for, and the increasing trends still exist even when you account for these measurement issues, but they are there and it's important to be aware of them. So then why the kind of back and forth between 1990 and today? What's happening? Is mental health actually getting better? And what are some of the factors that might be affecting these issues for millennials today? Well, the individualism and the perfectionism, those two cultural trends in the West still very much exist and arguably have gotten worse since the 1990s. So those are still at play and could be driving some of the increase. We also, though, have seen much more treatment. So mental health treatment has gotten better and it's gotten more widely available and accessible. So funding for mental health treatment has increased since the 1990s. There's also been quite a big rise in the prescription of antidepressants in particular. And I think it is 10.8% of Americans have been prescribed an antidepressant in the past year. So we actually see quite a bit of treatment, either medically or cognitively, socially, for mental health issues. And that perhaps has contributed to the decline in the numbers that we see. There's also a protective factor that some researchers have studied with millennials, in that millennials as a generation are have the highest self-esteem than any generations before them, and they also have they call it, there's narcissism scales, so it's a little bit of a negative word, but millennials actually score highest on the narcissism scales than any generations before them, and this actually is protective for mental health issues. So some people believe that this is buffering some of the stress that people are experiencing, their high self-esteem and social concept. Some of the factors that might be worsening mental health for millennials in particular are, we talked earlier about the difference between expectations and reality. Millennials as a generation, especially in the West, are actually earning less than their parents and their grandparents. So this is the only generation we've ever seen in recent history that has actually experienced a decline in income earning potential. And that certainly affects people, as well as increasing income inequality. That's a factor that affects mental health for the population. And then lastly, there's this complex role of social media. So the jury is still out. Some people believe that social media actually increases negative mental health issues because it involves social comparisons, and people look at other people and wish that they were doing that well. And it also involves more networking, but less connection. So people are more connected to each other, but have weaker ties. And you actually need strong ties to promote positive mental health. You need social support that is real and tangible, not just a connection that might be actually not a true friend. So there's different things at play, but also social media, depending on how you use it, can promote mental health, because there could be quite a bit of social support that you could access, and you could perhaps get away from the isolation that you're experiencing in your day-to-day life by connecting with an online community. So it really depends on how you use social media, if it's a good or a bad factor. So we see a lot going on, and to answer the question about are millennials more stressed than previous generations, the answer is it's complicated. It's hard to say. Certainly there are a lot of stressors going on, and since the 1990s, mental health has been very bad, especially for young adults. But things might be getting better, and so that's encouraging, actually. Now I want to talk about issues on campus, and I know that several of you are students, so I hope that this is especially relevant for you. So mental health is a particularly poignant issue on campus, and most campuses have started to do something about it because it's very prevalent. So by 2007, 40% of college students had scored above 70 on this scale of anxiety, and that's actually like beyond the cutoff for anxiety disorder. And we see that happening in many scales, that for the time that people are students, they actually perform worse on mental health scales. So added to the issues that we talked about for millennials in general in the previous slide, we also have particular issues for students. And we have quite a bit of pressure to succeed, for example, and we have social comparisons that are more dramatic than they are in other situations when you're not directly compared to your peers and you're not competing for grades. We also have financial issues with paying tuition for campus students that are very stressful and contribute to mental health issues in this population. And then we have changes, big life changes in terms of routines. Often people move to go to school, and that's very disruptive and very stressful. And then there's the problem of fitting in with a new group. And as I mentioned, social ties are very important for mental health issues. And so if you're not feeling like you fit in with the people on campus, and this is particularly an issue for racial and ethnic minorities and low-income students, then the campus experience actually could be negative. On the flip side, campuses are very social places, and they actually are a very good place to promote mental health if you do it properly. So we do have these added stressors of being on a campus, but we also have added resources. So colleges and universities tend to have physical activity equipment. They tend to have meal plans and, good diet support. They tend to have regular activities that people can join, social activities, clubs, and groups, and they tend to be relatively safe places where the rates of violence and crime are lower than they are in other places. So in a lot of ways, campuses are kind of ideal places for good mental health promotion if it's done properly. So I think what I'm seeing, and I've worked a little bit with our campus mental health strategy here at the University of British Columbia. I should have said that in my introduction. So I am a researcher in Vancouver, and I work at the University of British Columbia on mental health research. And so I've worked a little bit to design a mental health strategy for the university, and I think there is the potential to transform colleges and universities from stressful places to actually places that people can thrive and learn and feel very supported and not as stressed. But I think we have a long way to go to get there. So I want to mention one more big issue before I close up my talk, and that is substance use. So substance use disorders are actually considered a psychiatric disorder. And most of my research I mentioned is on addiction and mental health. So I look at the co-occurrence of substance use disorders and mental health issues. And the reason I bring it up is because you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. Most people use substances without any issue at all. A lot of people perhaps on this call will have a glass of alcohol from time to time maybe, or people use all kinds of substances. I'm drinking coffee right now, which has caffeine in it, which could be considered a substance. It's a mind-altering substance. So most people use substances without any issue, but about 10% of people who use substances eventually develop some kind of disorder with it, and that those rates can be even higher depending on how you measure it. And if you look across the whole lifetime, it can be even higher, 15% perhaps. So if we look at this orange bar here is people who only have mental health issues throughout their lifetime. And this is the data set I used for my dissertation, actually. So this is the sort of 1 in 5 number that we kind of talked about earlier. And this is a lifetime statistic. So at any point in your life, there's about 20% risk of having a mental health issue only. There's about a 14% risk of having a substance use disorder only. This is the red pie slice here. And then co-occurring disorders, where you have mental health issues and substance use issues at the same time, actually happen in about 17% of the population. And this this group is largely overlooked because we have designed mental health systems as being completely separate from addiction treatment systems. And because both of them have been very stigmatized, there's not a lot of research, and not a lot of research that looks at the overlap between these two areas. And the last comment I want to leave you with is that these are very gendered issues. So mental health disorders and substance use disorders vary quite a bit depending on whether you're a man or a woman. And so this is what the graph looks like for the whole population. But then if you look just at men, the graph looks actually much different. So substance use disorders jump up to 20% of the population. So substance use disorders are much more common for men than they are for women. And this is true in adolescence, it's true for millennials, and it's true all the way throughout the life course. Whereas other mental health issues are less prevalent in the population for men. So then, and co-occurring disorders stay about the same, actually. There's not too much gender variation in co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. But then if we look at women, we see the opposite. So we see that women tend to be more often diagnosed only with a mental health issue like depression or anxiety, and very much less frequently are diagnosed with a substance use disorder only, which is this red bar here, about 8%. Co-occurring disorders stay actually very similar to the population average, so that's around 16%. And so we can think about lots of different reasons for this, and I did my whole dissertation on it, so I could talk about it for hours, but I'll just say briefly that these differences are thought to be related to the way that men and women process emotions, and very generally and broadly, I'll say that women tend to internalize stressors. So when we talk about stress that happens in the family environment, in the workplace, women tend to internalize it. And often, if it gets to the point of reaching a disorder, that will be expressed through depression or anxiety. Men tend to externalize stressors, and that means that they express stress through, typically, and this I'm painting in broad strokes here, but typically men tend to have higher rates of substance use disorders, and also some of the more personality-based disorders and violence as an expression of stress. So we see that reflected in the trends for disorder. And I did my whole dissertation on the role of early childhood, so I'm going to leave that topic for another day. But just to say that when we look back at this this issue of mental health throughout the life course, and we were talking about adolescents and millennials as being this group in particular that feels the brunt of mental health issues in the population, it actually starts very early on. So we now know through research on adverse childhood experiences that the things that happen to you before age 16, typically, tend to leave very deep imprints on your life. So it's not that, something traumatic happens and you get over it and you're fine. It actually embeds these experiences embed themselves into people's lives and into people's responses and reactions, neurologically and also physiologically. So we see physical health issues and mental health issues develop much later in life from stressors that happen much earlier in life. And I'd be happy to talk more another time about adverse childhood experiences and differences for men and women and things like that. So now, to return to our question that we asked at the beginning, which is, what proportion of a mental disorder is attributable to genetic factors? Now I want to ask you what you think. Now that we've talked about all of these social and cultural influences, has your number changed at all? What do you think the number is for the percentage of a disorder that's determined by genetics? And I'll just give you the answer since we're about to start talking anyway. So the answer is actually B. It's 25%.
25%?
Yeah.
I guess it's like 15.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's been an overemphasis in the media on the role of genetics in mental health issues. And I think it's been that way in part in part, it's perhaps done some good, actually, because I think it's reduced stigma by saying this is not something that's your fault. This is something that you inherited genetically, and you can't do anything about it. But at the same time, that leaves that doesn't pay proper attention to the other 75% of influences, which are social, typically, and environmental. So when we overemphasize genetics, we underemphasize the things that we can actually change, right? Because we can't change that 25%. We can't change the role of genetics, but we certainly can change people's social environment. And I think that by moving the conversation to the social factors that we can modify, then we can help people to actually thrive. And so I want to leave you with some things that you can do for yourselves and for your friends and family to promote positive mental health. And these are all evidence-based, and I can share with you the resources. But the first thing, and the thing that I keep coming back to, is social contact and connectedness. So having regular contact with friends and family, and having somebody to talk to and doing activities with those people is incredibly important. That is one of the biggest factors that affects mental health outcomes. The second one is physical activity, whether it's walking or playing a sport. Being active, actually, with depression in particular, physical activity is as effective as antidepressants in treating depression. And this works both from the bridge perspective and from the river perspective. So if we're talking about fixing the bridge, you can, and preventing things before they happen, you can regularly incorporate physical activity into your life as a preventative way to buffer some of the stress. And if you're starting to feel negative in terms of your mental health, you can start doing physical activity, and it will help with some of the negative feelings that you're experiencing. You can also develop healthy coping mechanisms, and these are different for every person, but it might be, perhaps it might be listening to music that you like. It might be doing art. So finding a way to express yourself and to process the emotions that you're feeling in a healthy way is very beneficial. The second, now we're down to 4. The fourth thing you can do is improve your self-confidence. So remind yourself that you are valuable, and remind your friends and family that they are valuable and they are important and that they are good at lots of things. And improving your self-confidence actually helps to buffer against negative mental health issues. Spirituality, religion, and meditation also help with mental health issues. So whatever that means to you, you can find a way to incorporate that into your life and with your friends and family. Healthy relationships are very important. So not being in relationships that are coercive or are negative for you, but actually relationships that help to support you. Being involved in the community. So again, whatever that means to you, finding a way to have a role in the community around you is positive for your mental health. Eating a good diet and getting a lot of sleep are actually factors that statistically contribute to positive mental health. And then the last thing is finding meaning and purpose. And this is a tricky thing, but finding something in life, it doesn't have to be work, but it could be work. Or it could be volunteering, or it could be raising children. But finding something that gives you meaning and a reason to wake up every day actually really improves your mental health. And then we can also improve mental health in our systems, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, by decreasing stigma and not reacting to people who have mental health issues and who are behaving in odd ways. We can give people opportunities to be involved and to participate. So, so having ways for people to join community groups and to volunteer actually promotes mental health for the whole community. And then economic stability. So I didn't talk too much about economics, but my whole dissertation was actually on childhood poverty. And poverty is a factor that increases mental health issues dramatically. And we all know this, right? When we're stressed about paying bills, it really affects you. And so when we provide stability for people in terms of knowing where their money is going to come from and that they're going to be okay, even if they lose their job or even if something dramatic happens in their life, can be very powerful. And so here I think there's a role for systems like universal basic income, perhaps, to promote economic stability for the whole population. Then having food and housing security so that you can get a good diet, you can have physical activity, and you can sleep for the whole population is important. And then building in social support to our workplaces and to our institutions is very important. So these are all ways that we can make a difference. Here are some of the references that I used, and I'm happy to share them. And I'm so appreciative of your time and your attention. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenna. Your last presentations makes me thinking like, as a man, so I'm potentially get more stressed than a woman. That's surprised me. Like, oh, okay, so woman is more stronger to like handling stress rather than man. And you know, today in Indonesia, I don't know, today or yesterday, we celebrate Kartini Day. So Kartini is like a one icon of woman, like heroes in our history. So he is a woman that enlightened people to be more educated. So we celebrate in April 21. So related to your like a woman is more maybe can handling stress better than men is it's kind of interesting for me.
Well, they handle them in different ways, right?
Okay,
Like women internalize the stress, which
Mhm.
can be negative because it increases depression and anxiety, but men externalize the stress.
Yeah.
And so you're right, it's very different. And we don't often think about that, but women tend to have more social connections.
Sure.
And yeah, so definitely lots of gender differences.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Maybe some of you have a question for Jenna.
How
Please.
about, yeah,
Okay,
how
Tika.
about in terms of vulnerability between men and women? Maybe in terms of handling, women is stronger than men, but how about in terms of vulnerability? Is it the same? Is it, I mean, men who are more vulnerable, or it is women who are more vulnerable to the mental health issues?
It's a good question. So let's go back to that slide and I'll show you the chart again. So the answer depends on what kind of mental health issues you're talking about. So women are more vulnerable to, this is the chart for women. They're more likely to get mental health issues only, right? Women are much more vulnerable, if you want to use that word, to getting depression and anxiety, and much less vulnerable to getting substance use disorder. So, yeah, so I think one thing that we talk about, which might be the opposite of vulnerability, is resilience. And that means that no matter what stress happens in your life, you're able to bounce back from it. You're able to realize that it's just a stress, it's just one thing, and you know that you will actually be okay. And so this ability to deal with stress and to sort of keep going no matter what happens really impacts mental health. And the gender differences in resilience and you know the opposite of that, vulnerability, it's hard to measure, and it really depends on what condition you're talking about. So I would say that overall women tend to have like slightly higher resilience, but it's actually not, it's not that clear. And women tend to experience slightly higher rates of trauma than men do. So there's that as well, right? If you have different exposures to factors that make you vulnerable. So then if we look back at the chart for men for a second, we see this, the orange slice is 13% have mental health issues only. So that's very different from, oh, sorry. That's very different from the 25% for women, right? But then if you look at the red, the red bar for women is only 8.5%. For men, it's 20.9%. So, and a substance use disorder is a type of mental health issue. It's a type of mental disorder. So men are much more vulnerable to substance use disorders. And the thinking behind that is that substance use is more socially sanctioned for women. It's less acceptable for a woman to drink and to use drugs and have an addiction. Whereas for men, there's less kind of social control on that. So it's, yeah, the thinking is around both the vulnerability and around the social availability, I would say. It's a great question, though, and it's something, as you can tell probably with my answer, that we don't really have clear answers on. But hopefully the research will continue to evolve in that direction. Yeah.
Okay. Ada feedback? Any feedback by him? Or we
Yeah.
go?
Can I ask other questions, or
Sure.
maybe
No,
other first? Maybe.
We go to the other person first.
Okay.
Then we can get back to you.
Yeah.
Tika, you raise your hand.
Okay. Hi.
Can you
Hello.
introduce name and where you're from before you asking
Okay.
questions?
Hello, Jenna.
Hello.
I'm Tika from Indonesia. Well, I'm a mother, full house wife. I want to ask you, as a millennial mother in our country, stressful is very influenced by our environment, especially through social media, among mother. And it's like competition for us, like housewife versus working mom, using clothing versus disposal diapers, normal birth versus sexual, etc. And
Yes.
how? What is your opinion about that? And then how to reduce that stressful, especially not have a big impact to our family and our children. Thank you.
That's a really great question. Yeah, so I think the social comparisons on social media are incredible, and young moms, I'm in my 30s and mid 30s, and everyone around me is having babies. All of my friends are new moms, and I see the competition, and it's a strange thing, because I see people that don't want to be in competition with each other. They wish they weren't comparing and and feeling bad that their baby isn't talking yet, or feeling bad that they breastfed the wrong way or something. They don't want to do that, but it's hard not to, right? Because you see other people on social media, and you can't help but to make comparisons. And as human beings, our brains are wired to make comparisons and for competition. So I think that some of the research on social media, and I mentioned in social media, is positive in some ways, but it's negative in other ways. And exactly what you're talking about, the comparison part of it is the negative part. And I will say that the studies that have shown that social media can be positive are studies that show communities online where people support each other, rather than loose connections where people compare to each other. So if you could find like a support group, or create maybe a support group online for new moms, where you don't maybe talk about where everybody's baby is at in terms of milestones, and maybe don't talk about the competitive issues as much, but instead talk about the problems, and make it so if you can create spaces where people can talk about their frustrations and challenges, that really helps to reduce the stress, and to make everybody understand that it's very normal. It's very normal to have stress, and especially when you're raising children, like there's so many things that happen, and so much of it is just trying to get by one day to the next. And I think that to normalize that, and to have a group that supports you in that experience, could be very helpful. And then the other things you could do are perhaps, if you're finding social media to be negative, perhaps spending less time on it, and potentially doing some of the other things, like going for a walk instead. So finding somebody on social media that lives close to you and saying, hey, let's get off Facebook and let's go for a walk instead. And doing, or maybe meditation, or volunteering in the community. So if you're finding that social media is challenging and actually not healthy for you and for your kids and family, maybe then it's better to replace that with other activities where you're meeting people face to face, because people tend to be less competitive face to face. It's easier to be mean. It's easier to be competitive and to be mean online when you're behind a screen. So Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I hope to see more research in this area because I think it's so important and it's a big issue in all countries, I think. Yeah.
Right. Any feedback, Tika?
No, it's very clear.
Okay, cool, cool. Anybody else have any question for Jenna or sharing your experience about handling stress? Okay, Mbak Nurul, please.
Okay, it's Jenna said that campus is one of the stable environment for decreasing mental health, if I didn't mistake. But that we are know that campus is also very what we call competitive environment for the student about the academic thing and then also the social activity. So how we can make the campus environment be in the positive competition, not in the negative way. Maybe you have experience, or maybe the others.
Yeah, that's another great question. I think campuses everywhere are trying to figure that out. I've seen a couple good campus strategies, and we'll see, I think, in the future, some of the positive things that I've seen campuses do. So I guess, yeah, so the first thing is to have a multi-level strategy. So to have a strategy for things that you do at the individual level, like offering counseling services, and having policies in place for stress leave for students and making it easier for accommodations for mental health issues for students if they need them during exams, if students need to write in a quieter place or things like that. So there's things to do at the individual level to reduce stress. And then there's things that you can do at the sort of community level in terms of the campus. So that would be, I guess, things like starting a club or a group to talk about mental health, and starting a support group for students who are struggling, and for students who are doing well too, because we all need mental health support no matter what phase of life we're in. So starting a support group for students, that's where people can talk about the challenges they're having and just get somebody to listen. It's very interesting that a lot of the benefit of social contact and connectedness in terms of mental health is actually just from people listening. Even if you can't change somebody's situation, being able to talk about it actually makes the situation better, which is, kind of counterintuitive, but it's true scientifically, that we know that even just talking about something, if it doesn't change, it still helps to talk about it. So I think support groups on campus for students, and having things like physical activity more available and accessible, and giving students time, like having a decreased, fewer exams and less stressful testing environments and things like that, so that students can fill their time with positive things like joining a religious group on campus, or playing sports. And so individual professors can structure their classes in ways that promote mental health. And then the last thing I think is so we talked about the individual and the community level, and then there's sort of the structural level within campuses. And there are things that the university can do there too, like increasing the green space on campus, so planting more trees, increasing the availability of quiet spaces and reflective spaces. They can also offer tuition support for low-income students. That really helps with mental health issues. And I could share with you some, like the mental health strategy that I've worked on a little bit in Canada for the Canadian universities that has some of these suggestions in it more specifically. But I would say, like, it's something we're still all trying to figure out. Like, universities and colleges are trying different things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And we're kind of all, mental health is a very new field. It's something that's been stigmatized for a long time. So now that there's more research and more funding, we're starting to develop solutions and test them. And we still don't know, actually, in some cases, what the best things to do are. So stay tuned, I guess.
Okay. Manurul, do you have feedback for that answer?
Not for this time.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure. We can move to other question. Bye, please. You have any question?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. So
please introduce yourself first, like very quick.
okay, so hello Jen, my name is Bahai. I'm from Indonesia. I'm living in Oregon actually, kind of close from your place.
Yes,
So
it's early for you too.
yeah, so actually I have some questions. Yeah, I have 5 questions actually about your presentation. Yeah, because it's very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting for me. Even though I'm not a social student. I mean, like I'm not learning in social science, but this is very interesting. This topic is very interesting and also very important for our society. So, but talking about your research that you have been done before, I'm really sure about the indicator of mental health that your study about. So this, can you just explain a little bit about what kind of indicator in mental health that you measure with the adolescent people in the area, in your area?
Yes.
You get what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we go one at a time through the questions? I'll answer that first.
Yeah, the first question first.
Yeah. Okay. So often in studies, we do what's called a research diagnosis. So in order to come up with in order to come up with this chart, for example, so this is a population level study. It sampled 40,000 people representative across all of the states, all different age groups, and yeah, and so what it involves is a 2-hour interview with people, and it asks them about symptoms that they've had throughout their life. So you can actually diagnose a mental disorder that somebody had previously by asking them about their symptoms. So you can say, is there ever a time in your life that you have, been hearing voices or seeing things that other people didn't see? Has there ever been a time in your life, for 2 weeks or longer where you felt like you couldn't muster the energy to do something, you couldn't get out of bed? So there's a set of diagnostic questions, and you don't just rely on one question. The questions for depression, for example, there's typically about 20 of them, and you need to answer all 20 in order to know if somebody has a diagnosis of depression. So these measures are well validated, and the one that was used in this particular study is called the CIDI, the CIDI. It's the clinical interview. I think it's for diagnostic, I forget what the last I is, but it's a clinical interview that diagnoses mental health issues. And so somebody doesn't have to know that they have depression or anxiety or substance use disorder in order to get diagnosed using this instrument. So it's a 2-hour interview, and then by the end of it, you can tell what issues somebody has had. And so this measure is throughout the lifetime. So at any point in somebody's life, if they've ever had a mental health issue, even if it was only for a month and it's no longer there, or if they've ever had a substance use disorder, even if it was 20 years ago and they're not experiencing it anymore, that's what this is looking at: lifetime diagnosis at some point of mental health disorder of any type. And there's a whole list of mental disorders that are diagnosed using this instrument. Yeah, it measures everything from social anxiety all the way to mania and bipolar, personality disorders, gambling addiction. Yeah, so it's a wide-ranging tool. I could share it with you if you're curious, if you want to see what the interview looks like. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, bye. We can we can wait for your next question. I mean, maybe somebody else have another question first.
Oh, another question first? Okay.
Oh, no. Okay. Anybody else before I continue his second question?
Okay. Yeah.
Anybody else have any question? No? Okay, but you can continue while we waiting for others' question.
Yeah. So thank you for the answer for my first question. And the other question that I'm really interesting to ask is about the factor of the mental health that happening in the people that you use for your research. So what kind of factor that probably is like the main factor why people in the United States or in Canada being like mentally ill or mentally not really good, like that's all about the education or about family background or about economy or something like that. I just want to make it clear,
Yeah, it's a great question. So we talked about genetics making up about 25% of the factors that influence disorder. So that other 75%, in my study, I focused on early childhood experiences. So trauma and abuse and neglect and poverty that happen early in childhood. And early childhood events, depending on how you measure them, can account for anywhere from 5 to 20% of the influence towards a disorder. So I'll go to that slide a little, maybe we'll see here. Yeah, so it's not just the type of, not just the number of experiences. So we ask how many different terrible things happen to people during childhood, but also we ask about the type of experiences, the frequency, and the severity. So those, that was the focus of my research, and depending on how you measure it and which group you're looking at, it can factor anywhere from 5% right up to 20% of the role in disorder. And then there's also, so early childhood is definitely a risk factor, stressful early childhood. There's also then added stresses and some of the things that we've been talking about throughout the presentation. So stress that comes from social and economic conditions, from not being able to pay your bills, stress that comes from wanting to be perfect and not being able to be perfect. So this focus on perfectionism and individualism. And then there's also workplace stresses and conflict. Then there's things like divorce and harmful relationships in people's lives, death, and these stressful life events. And so I would say those are the major ones. And in my study, I focused on early childhood. So those are really the only ones that I have numbers and specific, specific evidence for. But the other factors all contribute as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Baim, you have any other question?
Yeah. Probably
Okay,
I just wanna give the feedback for my second question. So I'm really sure that there are so many factors that's influencing to the mentality, like education, family background, economy, and also if you are talking about the United States and also Canada, there are so many people from different countries come over to this country, and I think also it's like more complicated to study about it because there are so many people from different countries. And have you ever tried to compare the social problem in United States or other countries? And I just curious if you have some information about it, and it's like good information also for everybody.
Yeah, it's another really good question. There are so I focused on gender differences just because that's what my study focused a little bit more on, but I did do an investigation of racial and ethnic differences in mental health. And it's very complicated. As you said, there's a lot of factors, and especially for people who immigrate to the United States, there's all kinds of added stressors. There's you know, there's acculturation and the stressors of trying to fit into a new society. There's stigma and, you know, rejection and racism that people experience. And then there's added economic pressures for immigrants, usually as well. And then there's issues of missing back home and, you know, worrying about family back home. And I myself was an immigrant to the US for the 4 years that I lived there. And, you know, even being somebody who has white skin, who looks like nobody would know I was an immigrant in the US if I didn't tell them. And I, you know, can speak and read and write English very well. So all of those factors made it much easier for me. But even then, I found it difficult. I found it difficult to fit in and to make friends at first. And my tuition was double because I was a foreign student. And so I think there, you know, I experienced firsthand some of the issues that are there for people who move to a new country, but there's so many of them that I didn't experience, the racism and the kind of loss of culture and community that can happen. So you're absolutely right that these issues are very complicated, and multiculturalism complicates them even further. There is a decent amount of research on racial and ethnic differences in mental health issues. And I will say that it really depends on where you look, the results. So in the US, and this is probably going to surprise people, it's certainly surprised me when I learned it, but in the US, racial and ethnic minorities actually tend to have better mental health than people who are white and people who are not immigrants. So immigrants actually have better health typically than people who were born in the country. And there's been quite a bit of research and theory as to why that might be the case, because that's really, you know, for a lot of us, it doesn't make sense because of all the stressors that I just talked about that are unique for immigrants. So I don't know that I have time to go into it. I didn't really mention it in my talk because it, you know, you could talk about it forever, but people think that that's due to two reasons. One, primarily that there is the measures that we have for how you detect mental health issues are not very culturally sensitive. So if I ask questions about depression, it might not make sense to somebody, and the way that they experience depression in their culture might be different. In collective societies, for example, there's less focus on individual feelings and individual outcomes. And then so there's a problem with the way that we ask the questions. There's also a problem with the way that people, typically racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants in the US and in Canada, tend to be less comfortable admitting mental health issues. So even on surveys, they tend to underreport. So that might be part of the reason we see lower rates. And then the last thing is that racial and ethnic minorities tend to have stronger social networks. So even though they move and, you know, they move and it's very isolating and traumatic, they also tend to have much stronger social ties, whether it's to people back home or to people around living in the community that they live in. So that is beneficial. And so anyway, it's a very complicated area. There's people who spend their entire careers trying to figure out mental health differences for different cultures. And yeah, I'm sorry that I couldn't say more about it because it's very interesting, and yeah, it's a big area of research.
Interesting. So everyone, we have 15 more minutes, I think, for our discussion today, but we still open for other questions. Maybe some of you, so we have friends from Australia, Tunisia, Mas Muntaha atau Mbak Maria Ulfa, you want to share something from there? Or Mas Kirilu? Anyone? Okay, Mbak Nurul. Okay, please, you can ask.
Okay, I have another question. It's about the age. You separate the either in your slide you have age from baby, young adult, and what about the resilience? People from mental health based on their age, in which age we have a better resilience to get a better mental health.
Oh, that's a great question. Resilience across time. It's tricky. So yeah, let's go back to this slide here. Okay. Oh, I have to go back so far. Okay. Yeah, so what age group is the most resilient? I would say, like, I don't know if you can see it, but this, oh, maybe I can actually, yeah, this group right here. There we go. Yeah, children tend to be very resilient. So even though I said factors that happen early in life imprint us for the rest of our lives, children have very flexible brains. So your brain is constantly changing throughout early childhood, and your new connections are being formed, and your brain is actually very good at healing itself. So what happens with these early childhood events, so things that happen, you know, in this phase of life, and even in childhood too, what happens is that traumatic things happen, and we don't really equip children very well to deal with them. And so those can have negative impacts later on, because as a society, we are not very good at helping people to cope with trauma and stress. But if you do help people to cope during that phase, they have incredible resilience. Like, your brain can sort of rewrite itself right up until about age 20. So by age 21, your brain stops forming new pathways. So really, it's before age 21 when you have the most neural resilience, I would say. And if you can build in healthy coping mechanisms, and even if trauma happens and bad things happen to all of us, and so if bad things happen to children, you can encourage them to talk about it, and you can encourage them to some of the healthy and positive mental health strategies that we were talking about for individuals. You can support your kids and your friends' kids and you know, your family that way, by helping them to talk about things that are stressing them out, talk about things that they are sad about, talking about ways that they feel excluded and isolated. And even if you can't fix it, even if there's a child living in poverty and you can't change that, they can still talk about it, and that actually makes a big difference. So resilience in these early years is very important, and creating healthy coping mechanisms. So teaching children, if you're stressed, write about it in your journal, or if you're stressed, draw a picture or go for a walk. Find a way to express that in a healthy way, where you can identify your feelings and you can say, this is the way I'm feeling, but you know, I'm still okay. And so that kind of helps to create resilience for the rest of your life, because by the time you're our age, millennials, I think for many of us, I don't want to assume, but for myself anyway, a lot of your coping mechanisms and a lot of your strategies and mental pathways are already established. So really, yeah, one of the key times for prevention and to develop this resilience is in your teenage years and before.
Okay, Baim, you have a question?
Yep. Jenna, I just want to follow up by those questions and your explanation on contributing factor to mental health. I think it's quite interesting. I understand that from what you said before, that the factors, it's very complex, from genetics, individual factor, and the societal level. But I'm wondering, from all of these factors, which one is the most, what do you say, the most influential in the context of like US or Western countries? Because I'm wondering whether, like, if we do like kind of comparative research in the context of like developing countries, whether the contributing factors might be different between different contexts of society.
It's a great question. So I think that there's two things I would really encourage you to measure. One of them is the adverse childhood experiences. So things that happen early in childhood, those are one of the strongest predictors of mental health issues later in life. Yeah, and there's a very clear, we call it a dose response. So the number of things that happen to you, the severity and the frequency directly correlates to the mental health issues that you have later on. And like I said, that can be prevented. You can stop that chain if you have mentorship and, you know, good social support, but often we don't. And so we tend to see very strong correlations. So that's probably the biggest factor, and that's why I focused on it for my dissertation research. And I'd be happy to send you, you know, some of my papers if you're looking at ways to measure it. The other thing I would encourage you to measure is stressful life events, it's called. SLE, stressful life events. And so there's a questionnaire of the things that happen throughout people's lives: divorce, moving, death, unemployment, getting in a car accident, yeah, all of these things, abandonment. So there's stressful life events, and those can happen not just in childhood, but anytime. And those are also very strong contributors to mental health issues. So I would measure both of those for sure, if you wanted to compare. And then I think, yeah, if anybody else has other suggestions.
We're really happy if you can share your measurement or indicators so we can compare with Indonesia. Sure. Like Baim said, in Indonesian or developing countries, maybe we have a different factors influence to stress or depression or mental health issues. So that's if you share to us, and then I can share to anybody else for at least the measurement, like the indicators you measuring, and then like how the question you made, and maybe it's really helpful for us in here in Millennial Research Center to doing the same research. So we also conducting like survey, online survey, and some of our members like student and lecturer in university, so they can also try, and then we can share someday our result. So you can see like, oh, this is in Indonesia, we using the similar approach with yours, and then what is the result. So again, we can learn each other about this topic. So yeah,
that's great. Yeah, I would love that. I'll definitely share it with you.
Sure. So this one question from Tita.
Hi, Jenna.
Hello.
My name is Tita. I'm a Yana's wife, and I'm here as a full-time mom, taking care of 2 kids here, and it's stressful.
You said stressful.
No, yeah. So I live in Colombia, and I see it's so different how they treat the mental illness here and in my country. So I see, in my opinion, I see in here the culture build us to talk, more confident to talk with everybody and talk what's your problem, and also come to counseling, come to psychiatry. It's common here, but in my country, our culture made us struggling to talk with others. It's made us shy, and stigma is so hard. When you come to psychiatry, maybe some people say, "Oh, you are crazy, you are insane, you are in a big trouble." So that's maybe I want to share is the difference our culture in US and my country. We in the what is we call. So my point is, in my country, we better keep silent with our problem than talk to the other. And even we talk to the other, it make us feeling worse. So maybe somebody can judge us that, oh, your problem is because of you, because of you, because of this. So I don't know. Maybe you can share how to Canada or US made us feel better.
Yeah, it's so true. You know, this is something I've heard a lot of, and I haven't done work in other countries with mental health before, but I did work with the South Asian community in in Toronto quite a bit for many years, 7 years. I worked with a wonderful South Asian community group there. We were actually working on diabetes at the time. And one thing that we noticed was that a lot of people had depression, but didn't want to talk about it. And depression and diabetes actually co-occur very frequently, but in the South Asian community, it was not okay to talk about it. And people were stigmatized, and it was worse when they talked about it. And I think your point is really good that, you know, sometimes it's actually worse to talk about it. And so that's a reality. I think that's something that we can change one person at a time. You know, we can change it in our families. At least we can be supportive of our kids, right? And we can teach our kids that it's okay, and it's okay to talk about your feelings in safe places. You don't have to talk about it in, you know, somewhere that's going to make you feel bad. But within immediate family units, we can reduce stigma for our family and our friends. But then I think there's also, so I'll go through my slides back to the, let me stop writing here. Okay. Yeah, back to, oh no, now I have, now I have stuff on the screen. Okay, so back here to the things that you can do. And I think that some of the things that you can do, I'm just gonna erase, don't have to do with talking. So there are ways potentially in countries where it's not, you know, it's still stigmatized. There are ways that you can improve mental health without talking about it if the stigma is too strong. So there's things like you could, you know, organize a community event, go for a walk with other, you know, moms, and or organize a group that has another purpose. That, you know, maybe the purpose is to cook meals and bring meals to elderly community members. But through doing that, you're actually spending time with people, and you're doing an activity that gives you meaning. So you're actually helping people's mental health, even though you're not directly talking about it. I don't have a really good answer for that. I think it's a really good question, and it's something that other people have researched more than I have. So I think there might be some more literature on it that I'm not aware of. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it's true. It can be very different in different places.
Okay, I think we are like in the 10:30, and any last question before Jenna have a closing statement for us?
I have some question, Mas.
You still have some?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's very interesting for me as a millennial.
Okay, wait, Jenna, you have time until how many minutes? How many more minutes for you, Jenna? 2 more minutes, right? Okay.
No, I mean, I can stay a little bit longer. But
okay, sure,
yeah,
sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. Bye, but make it.
Yeah. So, yeah, that is something that I really underline on your presentation. It's something that, you know, probably is like the most powerful strategy for managing the social problem in every country or in wherever the area is. So it's about the social connections among the society, among the people. So do you have like, after you study for many years about mental health that's happening in everybody in United States or in you know, in Canada, so do you have like certain strategy or suggestion to the government about how to, you know, strengthen the social connection among the people, no matter it's like, you know, with different cultures, something like that. So you mentioned about people from other countries, they have strong connection with their community. That's why their mentality is like more healthy or more good or better than local people as well. So do you have like certain strategy or more, you know, yeah, something like that?
Oh yeah, that's a really great question. I wish I had a good strategy. It's tricky because especially in America and Canada and Western societies, we're seeing the opposite happen with social media, and with we're seeing an increasing focus on the individual, and people are more isolated. And even though the internet offers us an opportunity to connect with each other, we actually have weaker connections. So we have more connections, but they're weaker. And that's a problem from a mental health perspective. So I think, so I don't really have too many good answers, but I will say that recently, just 3 weeks ago maybe, very, very interesting, in the UK, the government actually created a ministry of loneliness. And
really?
Yeah. And I'll send you the link to the news article. And the interview with this new minister was very interesting. And he basically said, we're having this crisis where people are isolated and lonely and not connected. And this is a big problem for elderly people. It's a big problem for millennials. And we need to do something about it. We don't know what yet, but we're creating this ministry of loneliness to promote the opposite, to promote social connection. I don't know, there's things you can do, like, so income inequality in a society actually increases loneliness and isolation. That's one, we know that connection is there. So you could, try to equalize the incomes a little bit more in a country. That would help. You could also do things like, promote volunteerism. And so, the government could implement something. I'm just like, this is a crazy idea, but it's just an idea. The government could implement something where they pay for 2 weeks every year, or maybe it's 1 day a month or something, for people to take a break from their jobs and from their school, and the government will pay their salary for that day, and they go and volunteer, for example. That could be a way. Yeah. So ideas like that, where the government could create something that's not mandatory but optional, and for the whole population to get more involved in their communities. That could work. There could also be money set aside for physical activity, for example, because physical activity, it helps you neurologically, physiologically, but also you tend to do physical activity in groups. So it's a way of getting both social contact and also the physical benefits. Yeah, so making, I guess, centers open, free to the public for physical activity. So yeah, I don't have very good ideas, but I think we need more. I think we emphasize the problems too much and not enough the solutions. So researchers need to start thinking a bit more about solutions.
Yeah, more the solution.
Yes, that's really, really true, that we talk about the problem too much and then not bring the solution as well. So,
we forget the solution.
Yeah, this is part of solution, positive mental health at the individual level. So, okay, Jenna, I think it's time for us to, in the end of this Zoom, I mean, you can say some closing statement before you leave. And I also invite, I know that you have a lot of community in Canada. So next time we can just doing the same, if you don't mind, like we invite you again, sharing another topic in the mental health, or another topic like income inequality or something. And you can also suggest me some people from Canadian community that can also support our community here, because we built Millennial as a center as our community as well, so we'll not feel loneliness. So we don't need a ministry of loneliness in Indonesia, because people are still talking each other. So then maybe after you give your closing statement, and in the next, so we're doing this every week, and we invite every weekend. So we invite many speakers from different countries, and also within our countries. We share many topics about millennials, and also we doing some study, like a survey or like a research, and that's why I say that we can replicate your idea or approach to measuring Indonesian people about their I mean, like stress, depression, and mental health issues, so we can compare the result as well. So please give your closing statement for us.
Yeah, just, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm so interested by the work that you all are doing. And I would love to collaborate and to hear more about mental health in Indonesia. So yeah, please get in touch with me, and we'll we'll talk hopefully about future connections. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to all of you. And
what is the best way to? Maybe some of the members want to talk with you directly. They can send the email, or you have social media like Twitter.
Send an email, or you can find me on Facebook. And my name on Facebook is Jenna Marie, Marie. And no last name. It's just my first name and my middle name, Jenna Marie. So yeah, find me on Facebook, or we can talk by email. And yeah, and hopefully maybe you could come present to our group too. And so yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch in the future.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
Great.
And it's really great discussion. And we have, I count like more than 15, but now we have just 11, but we have 16 audiences. It's bigger than our usual discussion, like less than 15, like a 10 to 11, 12. But today, because of your topic and you, I mean, we have a lot of more than our daily discussion.
Great. I'm glad.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Jenna, and appreciate your time. And we will see you next time. I mean, this is the first, and this is not the last, I hope. So
great.
And Jenna is also one person in Universal Basic Income Earth Network. So she also one of the executive director there. So we can also share about basic income, universal basic income next time. Is that okay, Jenna?
Yes, of course.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jenna.
Thank you so much. Hello, thank you.